Good morning. My name is Giulia Toraldo. I am PhD in European Union Law at the University of Naples Federico II, and I will be accompanying you throughout this course, which is devoted to examining European Union law through the perspective of democratic participation, the right of initiative, and European citizenship. Over the next sessions, we will explore the theme of democratic participation in the European Union, with particular attention to European Citizens Initiative. Our aim is not only to provide institutional knowledge, but also to offer tools and activities that can be easily transferred to students. So we will talk about democratic participation in the EU, and in this lesson, we will try to uh, to speak about historical background, representative democracy, the main institutions, except for the European Parliament, which will be addressed a specific lesson. National parliaments and the democratic deficit, and also the right to appeal to the ombudsman, the European Citizen Initiative, and being a European citizen in old module dedicated to the democratic participation and the right of initiative. So let's start. Why a democratic participation is so important in a union of 27 member states? To understand the value of democratic participation in the European Union, it is useful to briefly recall its historical roots. During the Second World War, when Europe was devastated by conflict, a group of intellectuals and political exiles, among them Altiero Spinelli and Ernesto Rossi, drafted the Ventotene Manifesto. This visionary text, published in 1941, argued that peace and freedom in Europe could only be guaranteed through a supranational federation capable of overcoming the nationalism that had led to war. So after 1945, the idea of a united Europe was therefore not just an economic project, but above all, a political and democratic project. The 1957 Treaty of Rome launched the European Economic Community, yet the ultimate aim was already to create a shared space of peace, of stability, and participation. So this process reached a decisive stage with the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which formally established the European Union, introduced the European citizenship, and strengthened the powers of the European Parliament. So in this sense, democracy has been at very heart of the European project from the beginning. After the tragedies of fascism, Nazism, and the war, building common institutions also meant ensuring that citizens could take part in new ways in shaping the future of the continent. So the European Union is a unique reality in the world. 27 countries with different languages, cultures, and political and economic traditions that have chosen to share sovereignty on crucial issues such as the single market, the environment, security, and fundamental rights. In such a complex context, the democratic participation is not just an abstract principle, but an essential condition for ensuring legitimacy and cohesion. So, when citizens participate actively by voting, expressing opinions, signing petitions, or engaging in initiatives, they help ensure that European decisions are not perceived as being imposed from above, but rather as the result of a shared process. And in such a broad union, participation is the tool that transforms diversity into democratic strength, bringing a different perspective, experiences, and priority into the decision-making process. At the same time, participation strengthens the sense of common belonging. It is easy to perceive the institution in Brussels or Strasbourg are distant or complex. Yet, knowing that there are channels through which one can have a direct impact, from voting in elections to launching European citizens' initiatives, makes the union feel less remote and more connected to everyday life. So, in a political system involving 450 million citizens, participation is what prevents the emergence of a democratic deficit. Without the citizens' voice, decisions could be seen as technocratic or imposed by governments. With the participation, however, the union is based on constant dialogue across different levels, local, national, and European, and becomes stronger in facing global challenges. So, in short, in a union of 27, democratic participation is not optional. It is the key to legitimizing institutions, strengthening the bond with citizens, and turning Europe's diversity into a shared political value. But let's see in which sense we participate. When we speak of democratic participation, our first thought usually goes to voting, the act through which citizens choose their representatives. And indeed, voting remains the most immediate and fundamental form of participation. Yet, reducing democracy to this alone would be an oversimplification, because participation means much more. It includes expressing opinions, joining associations, mobilizing for a cause, or signing a petition, or taking part in a public consultation. So, in other words, democracy is not only about delegating to those who govern us, but also about actively engaging in public life. And in this respect, we can distinguish between two models: a representative democracy and a participatory democracy. The first is the one we are most familiar with. Citizens select their representatives and entrust them with decision-making power. And it is the basic model on which all EU member states are founded. The second broadens the democratic space. Citizens are not limited to member states to voting every few years in their member states, but have opportunities to engage directly with institutions, to contribute to policy making, and to increase the transparency of government action. So within the European Union, these two models coexist, because on the one hand, the European Parliament embodies representative democracy, and on the other, instruments such as petitions, public consultations, and European Citizens Initiative give citizens the concrete opportunity for direct participation. So the centrality of democracy in the EU is no coincidence. The Union is built on a set of shared values enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union. And this includes human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect of human rights, though, including the rights of minorities. And these are not abstract principles, because they shape policies and laws. We may think, for example, of the protection of linguistic minorities, the defense of media freedom, or the rules that guarantee free and fair elections in all member states. So a distinctive feature of participation in the EU is that it takes place on multiple levels. Every European citizen participates simultaneously in local, national, and European political life. The vote cast in municipal elections, the one cast in national parliamentary elections, and the one cast in European elections are all parts of a single multi-layered democratic experience. So, similarly, a petition drafted by an Italian citizen can reach Brussels and be debated at European level, showing that the participation is not confined by borders. And this makes European democracy more complex, but also richer in opportunities. So we might ask why participation is so important. Without citizens' voice, institutions risk appearing distant, overly technical, and detached from everyday life. And participation strengthens mutual trust between citizens and institutions, builds a sense of belonging, and reminds us that politics is not someone else's business, but a shared responsibility. And this is particularly true for young people, because once they realize their voices count, they are more likely to take an interest, to become informed, and to get involved. So democracy then is not a spectacle to be watched passively. It is a game to be played. So the European Union offers us instruments to engage at different levels, encouraging citizens to be protagonists rather than mere recipients of decisions that affect them. And so representative democracy that I mentioned is the form of government in which citizens select their representatives, such as members of the parliament, authorizing them to propose and to adopt laws on their behalf. Participatory democracy, on the other hand, refers to those mechanisms that allow citizens to be more directly involved in public decision-making processes, complementing and reinforcing representative democracy. But how are these two models translated into practice within the European Union? Because we cannot talk about participation without considering the institutions responsible for making European democracy work in practice. And it is through these institutions that the will of citizens is turned into decisions, into laws and policies that affect the daily lives of more than 450 million people. So, three institutions in particular play a central role. The European Commission, which drafts legislative proposals and opens channels for consultation and direct initiative. The Council of European Union, where the governments of member states sit, bringing together both the national and the supranational dimensions. The European Parliament, which directly represents citizens and gives voice to their vote. To speak about democracy in the EU, therefore, means looking at these institutional arenas as the spaces where representation and participation are concretely realized. So they are the heart of the Union's democratic functioning and the starting point for understanding how citizens can make their voices heard at the European level. So let's start from the European Commission. What does the European Commission do? The European Commission is often described as the engine of the EU because it is the only institution with the right to propose new laws. So it presents draft legislation to both the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. And in this role, the Commission protects the interests of the EU as a whole and of its citizens, especially in areas that cannot be managed effectively by individual member states alone, relies on experts and also consults public opinion when dealing with technical or complex matters. And beyond lawmaking, the Commission is also responsible for managing EU policies and allocating funding. because it sets EU spending priorities together with the Parliament and the Council, prepares the annual budget to be submitted for approval by the Parliament and the Council, and monitors how EU funds are used under the supervision of the Court of Editors. And another key role of the Commission is to ensure that EU law is properly applied. Working alongside with the Court of Justice, it checks that all member states complied with the rules they have agreed upon. On the international stage, the Commission acts as the voice of the European Union. It represents the EU in global organizations, especially in trade policy and humanitarian aid, and it negotiates international agreements on behalf of the European Union. Which is its composition? The Commission is made up of 27 commissioners, one from each member state. They work under the leadership of the President of the Commission, who assigns them different political responsibilities. The President is nominated by the European Council, taking into account the results of the European Parliament elections, and must be approved by the Parliament. The other commissioners are nominated by their national governments, but their appointment requires the agreement of the President, the European Parliament, and the European Council. Let's go now to the other institution, that is the Council of the European Union. What the Council of the European Union do that different from the European Council? The Council of the European Union, often simply called the Council, is one of the EU's main decision-making bodies. It brings together the ministers of all member states, who meet in different formations depending on the topic under discussion. For example, finance ministers, education ministers, or foreign affairs ministers. The Council plays a central legislative role. In most cases, it negotiates and adopts laws together with the European Parliament. The system known as the ordinary legislative procedure ensures that both the directly elected parliament and the governments of the member states share responsibility for EU lawmaking. The Council also coordinates national policies in areas where joint action is beneficial, such as economic and fiscal policy, education, culture, youth and sport, or employment policy. Building on the guidelines set by the European Council, the Council develops and implements the EU's foreign and security policy. And this includes humanitarian and development aid, defense cooperation, and also external trade. And it signs international agreements, or better, authorizes the European Commission to negotiate agreements with third countries or international negotiations. Once negotiations are concluded, the Council decides on the signature and conclusion of these agreements. And also, the Council and the Parliament jointly adopt the annual EU budget, which normally runs from January to December. And the budget defines how much the EU can spend and on what priorities, ranging from regional development to research, migration, or climate action. And what about its composition? There are no fixed members of the EU Council. Instead, the Council meets in 10 different configurations, each corresponding to the policy area being discussed. So depending on the configuration, each country sends their minister responsible for that policy area. And for example, when the Council meeting on the economic and financial affairs, the so-called ECOFIN Council, is held, it is attended by each country's finance minister. But who chairs the meeting? Well, the Foreign Affairs Council has a permanent chairperson, that is the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. All other council meetings are chaired instead by the relevant minister of the country holding the rotating EU presidency. For example, any environment council meeting in the period when Estonia holds the presidency will be chaired by the Estonian environment minister. Overall consistency is ensured by General Affairs Council, which is supported by the Permanent Representatives Committee. And this is composed of EU countries' permanent representatives to the EU, who are in effect the national ambassador to the EU. So I said three institutions: European Commission, the Council of European Union, and European Parliament. So what about European Parliament? In this lesson, we will not examine the European Parliament in detail, as it deserves a dedicated and more in-depth session. This because the Parliament is the institution that most clearly embodies representative democracy, and it is the one through which we can truly say that we are present at the level of the Union. But we can already anticipate that one of the most frequently debated issues concerning the European Union is the so-called democratic deficit. This term refers to the perceived distance between citizens and EU institutions. Many Europeans feel that decisions taken in Brussels or Strasbourg are remote, as I said before, technocratic, difficult to understand, and that ordinary citizens have limited influence over them. And this perception stems from several factors: the complexity of EU institutions, the fact that citizens often know little about their members of the European Parliament, the historically low turnout in European elections, and also the tendency of national governments to present as imposed by Europe decisions that they themselves helped to adopt. So the concept of a democratic deficit emerged in the 1970s, when European federalists used it to highlight the lack of direct democratic legitimacy in the community institutions. The idea was straightforward. If Europe was to become a true political project, citizens needed to be given more power, such as the direct election of the European Parliament, which indeed took place only in 1976. In the 90s, with the Single European Act and the Maastricht Treaty, the meaning of this expression shifted. It was no longer about a long-term political vision of a political union, but rather a reactive response to integration difficulties. Referenda in Denmark and France, with the disappointing results, revealed the growing distance between citizens and EU institutions. And at that point, the democratic deficit became a way to justify small incremental reforms, often introduced late and in reaction to problems, while economic and institutional integration advanced more quickly. So this transformation led some scholars to suggest a new term: democratic disconnection. While deficit implies an absence or a complete lack of democracy, disconnection highlights instead a gap to be bridged: the distance between the European level, where important political decisions are made, and the national level, where democratic legitimacy still rests through national parliaments. So This perspective recognizes that democratic dynamics do exist within the EU, but they are often poorly connected. On the one hand, the European institutions, and on the other, the national parliaments and the citizens. So the challenge is therefore to reconnect these two levels, for example, by strengthening the role of national parliaments so that decisions taken at the EU level do not appear distant or imposed from above. And to address this challenge, the EU has developed instruments designed to strengthen direct participation, such as petitions to the European Parliament, which allow anyone to raise issues concerning the application of the EU law, public consultations organized by the European Commission, open to citizens, associations, and businesses, and the European Citizens Initiative, which enables 1 million citizens from at least 7 member states to invite the Commission to propose new legislation. This mechanism do not eliminate democratic deficit altogether, but they represent steps towards bridging the gap and making the union more accessible, transparent, and participatory. And one of the most debated issues regarding the functioning of the European Union is the role of national parliaments, as I said. With the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, they were given certain tools to take part in the EU decision-making process. For example, by checking that new laws respect the principle of subsidiarity, meaning that the EU should only act when action at the national level is not sufficient. However, the treaties have never fully clarified that their functions to what their function should be. I mean, Article 12 of the treaty states that national parliaments contribute to good functioning of the union, but it does not explain how this contribution can be decisive. And scholars and practice show an ambiguous picture because in some countries, parliaments use their powers effectively, while in others they are more passive. And in addition, many instruments, such as the so-called political dialogue with the Commission, do not have a solid legal basis in the treaties. And this makes it difficult to assess whether national parliaments are truly playing a key role in European decision-making. But what role do national parliaments play effectively so in European Union? National parliaments are not European institutions, but they do have a role recognized by treaties, as I said, especially after Maastricht, Amsterdam, and Lisbon. And their role is important, yet indirect, and it lies mainly in the area of procedural legitimacy, in sense of transparency, of oversight, and dialogue. But let's see its main functions. We have the oversight of national governments, and that through which parliaments monitor the governments, which represent each country in the Council of the EU. They can request explanation, debate national positions before they are taken to Brussels and check how ministers vote. Then there is a subsidiarity check. That means they can review legislative proposals and from the European Commission to ensure that the EU acts only when necessary, that is, when action by individual states is insufficient. And if they believe subsidiarity is not respected, they can issue a yellow card or an orange card. And participation in political dialogue, that means that through exchanges with the European Commission and other parliaments, they contribute to discussion and can influence the direction of certain policy. And interparliamentary cooperation, that means that they take part in conferences and networks, for example, COSAC, which brings together the national parliaments and European Parliament to share experiences and coordinate positions. But there are also limits of their role because they do not have direct legislative power at European level. They cannot adopt or amend EU laws. They act more as watchdogs and observers rather than main players in EU decision making. And their effectiveness depends greatly on how actively each national parliament uses its powers. And some are very engaged, others much less, as I said. The concept of democratic legitimacy refers to the ability, of political power to be perceived by citizens as fair and deserving of consent. So legitimacy in EU studies is often divided into three dimensions. An output legitimacy that is based on results. Political power is legitimate if it delivers concrete benefits such as peace, economic growth, and well-being. Input legitimacy based on participations. Citizens have a say in decision-making through elections, representations, or other forms of involvement. And throughput legitimacy. That is based on process quality, transparency, inclusiveness, participation, and dialogue. From the very beginning, European integration relied mainly on output legitimacy, guaranteeing peace after the war and fostering economic recovery. In the 1980s and 1990s, however, it became clear that the greater input legitimacy was needed. So this led to two key developments: strengthening the powers of the European Parliament, directly elected since 1979, and now co-legislator with the Council, but we will see it in the next lesson, and involving national parliaments, especially after Maastricht Treaty. Yet the role of national parliaments has remained limited. They do not directly legislate at EU level. Instead, they act as oversight bodies, as I said, watchdogs, checking compliance with the subsidiarity principle and monitoring their governments in the Council and participating in interparliamentary cooperation. For this reason, their contribution is closer to the throughput legitimacy. It means that they make EU decision-making more transparent and deliberative, but also but do not substantially change political outcomes. So in short, the national parliaments are not the main actors in EU lawmaking, but they help bridge the gap between Brussels and citizens by improving the democratic quality of procedures. Well, the lack of a clear answer to this question show a key problem. The European decision-making bodies often suffer from weak democracy legitimacy, and improving the quality of debates and discussion is not enough if the institutions where decisions are taken are not fully democratic. So in many cases, other forms of representation prevail over direct electoral legitimacy. And in this sense, including national parliaments in the EU decision-making does not automatically strengthen representative democracy at the European level. And this because national parliaments do not really act as a political representatives within the European process. To truly do so, they would need to participate directly in the allocation of political power and choices, not just have the right to influence or react to them. So this highlights the tension between national parliaments and European representative democracy. Article 10, paragraph 2 of the Treaty on European Union mentions a link between the two. But in practice, their role remains limited and somewhat ambiguous. And in many cases, national parliaments seem to play only a formal or bureaucratic role without having a real influence on EU decision making. Sometimes they even use their powers against integration. And this shows the complex and often distrustful relationship between national parliaments and European governments. Already in 1970s, Denmark and United Kingdom, both very protective of their sovereignty, developed a strong control mechanism over EU decision-making, the so-called with the mandate system and the documentary system. And these later became reference models for other member states. Only with the Single European Act in 1986 did the Europeanization of national parliaments become part of a broader EU strategy. And in 1989, the COSAC, that is the Conference of Parliamentary Committees, was created and later mentioned in Maastricht Treaty, but the relationship between the European Parliament and the national parliaments remains unresolved. So, in the second phase, the UK House of Commons proposed the creation of a European upper chamber made up of representatives from national parliaments. And along the same lines, the Cameron Tusk Agreement, following the European Council of the 18 and 19 of February of 2016, included the British Prime Minister's request to introduce a red card veto power. Under this system, if parliaments representing more than 55 of the votes opposed the proposal, they could block it. Overall, the debate on the role of national parliaments in European governance has followed two main directions: the democratization of the EU and limits to further integration. The first element, the democratization, is usually emphasized in the treaties, like in Article 12 on democratic principle. The second, limits to further integration is often overlooked, even though the focus on subsidiarity checks shows how parliaments can also act as a brake on integration. And whether parliaments adopt a bureaucratic approach or a more national interest-driven stance, this risk is the same. They may become arenas of opposition to integration, weakening the EU's democratic legitimacy. So this suggests the need to rethink the role of national parliaments within a broader federal reform of the EU system of governance. Such reform would require different types of measures, both political and legal, to strengthen legitimacy, such as input legitimacy by making supranational institutions more democratic. For example, supporting truly transnational political parties, and output and procedural legitimacy by improving results, transparency, and the quality of decision making. So, Only a process of political and party integration can overcome the democratic asymmetries that affect the legitimacy of the EU, especially in countries where these gaps are most serious. So the first step must be accompanied by measures to strengthen output legitimacy through results, I mean. And the goal is to make EU policies more effective by simplifying decision-making processes, ensuring a consistency of competences so that policies are predictable and controllable, and, for example, in the area of taxation, and the multiplication of veto player, often the role taken by the national parliaments, does not improve legitimacy, nor do attempts to reclaim sovereignty, which often rest on a misunderstanding of what sovereignty means in the EU context. Instead, national parliaments should focus on monitoring their governments in the upstream of phase of EU decision making and contributing to greater transparency, to accountability and democratic legitimacy of EU institutions as envisaged or hoped by Article 10, paragraph 2 of the treaty. And finally, parliaments, including regional assemblies, play an important role in the downstream phase, implementing EU law and policies at national and regional levels. And here they can help preserve and reflect the diversity within the Union, which remains a core strength of the European project. So, in the next lesson, we will look at the role of European Parliament, an institution that at the beginning was somewhat underestimated. And yet, if you think about it, is the one that makes us feel most present at the European level. We will examine how it gradually carved out its place within the institutional framework and the fundamental role it plays in democratic participation. And we will also explore the instruments that citizens can use to take part directly in legislative process, as well as the means by which they can make their voices heard in cases of possible mismanagement by the Union. So thank you very much. I hope everything was clear, and see you in the next lesson.